Viktor Drovak, Luan Razek, and Amir Galeen, three men with shadowy pasts tied to a global conspiracy so dark it threatened to unravel everything. When Jane Ember was found drugged and disoriented in a hotel room, unable to identify herself, it seemed like just another case. But the truth was far more dangerous. Each man knew something about Jane, the mysterious key, and the secret they'd do anything to protect. Now, as the investigation unfolds, one question remains. Who is Jane Ember, and why does the world want her silenced? It was an ordinary evening in Philadelphia when the Emberlight Grand Hotel, a high-end luxury spot near the city center, received a troubling call from its staff. Guests in nearby rooms had complained about strange noises coming from room 417. At first, they thought it was nothing more than a late-night party. But as the noise escalated, sound of glass breaking, followed by loud, frantic movements, they decided to alert security. Hotel security officers knocked on the door several times, trying to get a response. There was no answer. The noises continued, now sounding like something more urgent. Security couldn't just stand by, so they called the manager, Mr. Henry Groves. Upon arrival, he unlocked the door with a master key. What they found inside shocked them. The room was dimly lit, the curtains tightly drawn. In the middle of the room, a woman lay slumped against the bed, her eyes closed, her body stiff. She appeared unconscious. Around her, 3 foreign men sat quietly, staring at the woman. All of them were dressed in dark clothing, their expressions blank, almost robotic. They didn't seem panicked, nor did they seem concerned. In fact, the men acted like nothing was wrong at all. Mr. Groves, trembling, immediately signaled to security to call the police. The men didn't flinch. They didn't move. It was as if they were waiting for something to happen, like they knew their presence wasn't a surprise. When the first officer entered the room, the men finally stirred. They slowly stood, but their actions lacked any urgency. None of them seemed willing to speak. Instead, they watched as the officer made his way to the unconscious woman. The officer kneeled beside her, noticing her shallow breathing. She had no visible injuries, but something was off. There were bruises on her wrists, as though she had been tied up or restrained recently. Her clothes were expensive, her appearance immaculate, yet her condition told a different story. The officer tried to gently shake her awake, but she didn't respond. She remained silent, motionless, like a doll discarded after use. There was an unsettling calm in the air, as if no one in the room was in a hurry to resolve the situation. Police. Backup arrived shortly after. The 3 men were instructed to sit on the edge of the bed, their hands placed on their laps. They complied without a word. The officers tried questioning them, but their English was minimal at best. One of the men, Viktor Drovak, tried speaking, but his accent was thick, and the words barely made sense. The others, Luan Razek and Amir Galeen, said nothing. Their lack of cooperation only raised suspicions. As paramedics arrived to examine the woman, she remained completely still. They tested her vitals and concluded she was stable but unresponsive. The decision was made to take her to the hospital for further observation. Yet, before they could even attempt to move her, the woman did something unexpected. She slowly opened her eyes, her gaze glassy, unfocused, and staring ahead. She didn't look at anyone directly, but instead seemed to be looking through them. When an officer tried to ask her name, she didn't respond. Instead, she shook her head slightly, almost imperceptibly. The officers were baffled. She refused to speak, refused to provide any identification, and seemed completely unwilling to engage in any sort of communication. In a moment of desperation, one officer tried a new approach, showing her an ID card and asking if she recognized it. She glanced at it for a moment, then her eyes shifted away. The officer was now sure that something was seriously wrong. She wasn't just a confused individual, she was actively avoiding the identification process. Whatever had happened to her, it wasn't something that could be explained by simple forgetfulness or confusion. The three men were handcuffed and escorted out of the room. They were completely unfazed by the situation, as though it was a regular occurrence. But their behavior only deepened the mystery. Why were they so calm? Why didn't they seem afraid of the situation they were in? Their indifference only raised more questions. As the woman was placed on a stretcher and loaded into an ambulance, she began to move her head slightly. A single tear escaped her eye, but she didn't make a sound. The strange, eerie silence surrounding her left everyone in the room unsettled. There was something unnatural about the way she behaved, and the more the police looked into the situation, the more questions arose. Why had she been with these men? What was she doing in this hotel room with them? And why, above all, did she refuse to identify herself? The moment the woman left the hotel, the staff began to speak in hushed tones. Rumors started to circulate about the events of that night, but none of the hotel employees could make sense of the strange encounter. One thing was clear. This wasn't just a case of a woman losing her memory or a simple accident. Something far darker was at play, and no one knew what the truth really was. The investigation had just begun, and no one could predict the shocking revelations that would unfold in the coming days. The next few days were filled with confusion and growing suspicion. The woman, whom the authorities had started calling Jane Ember after the hotel she was found in, refused to speak, even when she was placed under medical care. She was admitted to a psychiatric facility for observation, but nothing seemed to trigger any response from her. Her mind appeared to be locked away, and despite the best efforts of the doctors and specialists, no one could break through. She wouldn't talk, wouldn't write, and when they showed her pictures or personal items in an attempt to spark recognition, she remained unresponsive. The medical team conducted a full battery of tests, including neurological scans, blood work, and psychological evaluations. The results were perplexing. Physically, she seemed to be in perfect health, aside from the signs of sedation in her system. There were no signs of a stroke or any trauma to her brain. Yet, something in her mind was disconnected. Whatever had happened to her, it had left an indelible mark, but no one could figure out how or why. It was as if she was trapped inside her own head, unable or unwilling to communicate. Meanwhile, the three men arrested at the hotel, Viktor Drovak, Luan Rezek, and Emir Galine, were placed in separate holding cells. They all had one thing in common: they were foreign nationals, and none of them had provided valid identification. Victor's documents appeared authentic, but there was something off about them, anomalies that couldn't easily be explained. Luan's passport was a complete forgery, and Emir had no passport at all, only a set of fabricated travel papers that didn't match any known country's format. It was clear that they had been lying about their identities from the start, but their reasons for doing so remained unclear. As the investigation into the three men deepened, police discovered more strange details. Viktor Drovak, though seemingly the most cooperative of the three, had an unsettling background. He was listed under various aliases in multiple countries, his name appearing in files linked to shady dealings in Europe. His known whereabouts over the past few years were hazy, with reports of him being in and out of various countries, often in locations with high levels of political instability. Despite this, no one could definitively place him at any specific location for long. Luan Rezek, on the other hand, had a history of involvement with illegal medical research. He had worked in a now-defunct facility in Croatia that was under investigation for performing unauthorized biological experiments. The lab was shut down by international authorities, and many of its staff, including Luan, disappeared without a trace. The thought that he might be involved in something as sinister as human experimentation sent chills down the spines of the investigators. Was Jane Ember part of some twisted experiment? Was she a test subject who had managed to escape? Or had she been abducted? Amir Galin's background was the most concerning. His file was nearly empty, except for a few fragmented records. He had been connected to a series of international disappearances, people who had vanished without a trace and were later linked to covert government projects. However, there was no official record of any criminal charges. It was as if he existed, in the shadows, a ghost with no real identity. Despite their backgrounds, the three men were oddly calm during their interrogations. They answered few questions, and when they did speak, their responses were vague and sometimes contradictory. They denied knowing Jane Ember, claiming they had never seen her before. Yet their body language suggested otherwise. They were anxious, but not in the way someone would be if they were innocent. It was as though they were trying to hide something, and their nervousness was more about keeping their secrets buried than anything else. At the same time, Jane Ember's silence only deepened the mystery. She was moved to a secure medical facility for further observation, where her room was monitored 24/7. It was there that she began to exhibit strange behaviors. For the first time since her arrival, she started drawing in the corners of her room. The sketches were cryptic, symbols that didn't resemble anything from any known language. Some of them appeared to be mathematical equations, while others looked like complex geometrical shapes. At first, the doctors dismissed it as a side effect of her sedation, but the symbols seemed too deliberate, too organized to be random. They looked like coded messages. The breakthrough came when a linguist, called in to interpret the symbols, identified a pattern that resembled an old form of encrypted communication used during the Cold War. The symbols didn't match any known languages, but they followed a distinct set of rules. They were reminiscent of an ancient code used by spies and intelligence agents to send secret messages. This revelation changed everything. Could it be that Jane Ember wasn't just a victim of a random crime? Was she somehow connected to a covert operation? And if so, why had she been left behind? The more the authorities dug into the case, the more they began to suspect that Jane Ember was far more than a mere casualty of human trafficking or a random kidnapping. She might have been involved in something much larger, something international, something that could have been going on for years. The question of her identity remained unsolved, but one thing was becoming clear. Whoever Jane Ember was, she was deeply entangled in a web of secrecy that no one fully understood yet. And as the investigation into the three men continued, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to fall into place, each one more disturbing than the last. The days turned into weeks, and the investigation into the mysterious case of Jane Ember deepened. Despite the growing pressure from the media and the public, the authorities seemed no closer to understanding the full scope of what had transpired. The most perplexing part of the investigation, however, was the discovery in room 417. It seemed that the more they tried to uncover, the more questions emerged, and the answers only led to darker possibilities. A second search of the hotel room had been ordered. The police and forensic teams carefully combed through the space, hoping to find something that might lead them to a better understanding of the events that had unfolded. The room had been sealed off for investigation, but the team's initial search had missed something small, hidden in plain sight. It was the wall behind a large painting. The artwork had been deliberately placed at an angle that obscured a small section of the wall, which had been carefully scratched and carved with symbols. At first glance, the symbols appeared to be random, but when examined under specialized light, they revealed intricate markings, which seemed to be a mixture of letters and geometric patterns. The markings were faint, almost invisible, as if the person who had made them was trying to hide them from view. The symbols looked out of place in the luxurious hotel room, an unsettling contrast to the expensive decor. Detective Sarah Lance, who was overseeing the investigation, took note of the markings and immediately ordered a deeper examination of the wall. Forensic specialists took photos of the symbols before carefully cutting into the drywall to retrieve whatever was hidden behind it. After hours of careful work, a small compartment was uncovered. Inside, they found a collection of objects: a tiny black notebook, its cover worn with age, a few sheets of paper covered in a mix of code and strange drawings, and a small folded map. The map was the first clue that seemed to tie everything together. It was marked with several locations, coordinates to be precise. These coordinates weren't in any standard format, but rather an ancient set of numerics that had been modified. It took weeks for the experts to decode the numbers, but when they did, they revealed a series of remote locations across the globe. Some of these places were isolated military sites, others were abandoned research facilities, and a few were deep in the wilderness. But what was the connection? Why would Jane Ember have been linked to such places? The notebook held cryptic notes, many of which appeared to be written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. The writing was disjointed and erratic, jumping from one subject to another. Some entries referred to the gate, an unclear reference that seemed important, but there was no explanation of what the gate was. Other passages discussed the project and the need for secrecy. There was a sense of urgency, as if the writer was in danger of being discovered. The mention of a project, combined with the map's locations, pointed to a much larger operation, a covert operation spanning across continents, one that could involve espionage, experimentation, or even something far worse. But it wasn't just the notebook and map that intrigued the investigators. It was the strange item found in the mini-safe, a small metallic key. The key had no markings, no distinguishing features. It was simple, yet it carried a weight that felt significant. It seemed out of place in a hotel room. Who would need a key like this, and why keep it hidden in a hotel safe? The mystery of the key only deepened the suspicion that something far more complex was at play. The safe itself was unremarkable, an ordinary piece of hotel furniture. But the key, it didn't belong. When the fire broke out in room 417 a few days later, it seemed almost as if someone had been trying to destroy the evidence. The fire, though quickly contained by the hotel's sprinkler system, did irreparable damage to the room. Many of the items, including the notebook, map, and other documents, were ruined. But strangely, the key survived. It was found in the remains of the safe, untouched by the flames. The only thing that seemed to have escaped the fire was the most important piece of the puzzle. Authorities were immediately suspicious. Could the fire have been deliberately set to erase evidence? Who would want to cover up the truth? And why would someone go to such lengths to protect what had been hidden in that room? Surveillance footage from the hotel security cameras revealed something equally strange. One of the hotel janitors, a man by the name of Carlos Valdez, was seen entering room 417 shortly before the fire started. Valdez was not authorized to enter the room. His job didn't include cleaning or servicing that particular floor. Yet the footage showed him entering the room, carrying a small bag. He was inside for nearly 20 minutes before exiting, looking around nervously before quickly leaving the building. What was he doing there? Why was he alone? And most importantly, what did he take with him? The fire's origin was still under investigation, but it seemed too convenient to be a mere accident. Valdez, however, had disappeared without a trace. After the fire, leaving no clue behind as to where he had gone. He had vanished as if he had never existed. As the investigation into the fire and the mysterious janitor continued, the team began to piece together a disturbing picture. The strange symbols, the key, the map, the notebook, everything pointed toward something much larger, something darker. What had Jane Ember stumbled into? Who were the people involved, and what did they want with her? The investigation was now shifting from a missing persons case to something much more sinister, an international web of secrecy, manipulation, and dangerous people hiding in plain sight. The mystery was far from over, and the true extent of what was happening behind the scenes was only beginning to unravel. With each passing day, the investigation revealed new layers, each more chilling than the last. The disappearance of Carlos Valdez raised a new wave of anxiety among the investigators. It was as if he had simply vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind no trace of his whereabouts. His disappearance, coupled with the fire in room T417 and the mysterious key, led the authorities to believe that they were now dealing with an organized operation, one that had resources far beyond what they had originally anticipated. Detective Sarah Lance, who had been leading the case from the beginning, found herself immersed in a tangled web of connections that made her head spin. As she dug deeper into the background of the three men, Victor Drovak, Luan Rezek, and Emir Galine, she uncovered more disturbing details. They weren't just random criminals. Each of them had ties to a network of high-level operatives scattered across the globe. It wasn't just a human trafficking operation, or even illegal research. They were part of something much larger, something that had been hidden in the shadows for decades. Victor Drovak, the seemingly calm and collected leader of the group, had once been involved in the intelligence services of a European country known for its covert operations. His past was shrouded in secrecy, with only a few scattered pieces of information available. What was even more troubling was the fact that his last known assignment was linked to a covert project that had disappeared from the official records years ago. No one had known what happened to the project, but Victor had left behind a trail of questions that led to a secretive organization known only as the Syndicate. Luan Rezek, the medical expert among the three, had connections to a network of hospitals and research facilities that had been under investigation for years for their involvement in illegal medical trials. He was rumored to have worked on several high-risk projects involving human subjects, though his work was always classified. There were whispers of experimental drugs, gene therapies, and surgeries that defied ethical boundaries. But none of the evidence had ever been concrete, until now. Emir Galine, the quietest of the three, had the most troubling background. He had no official records before a certain point in his life, and when the authorities finally tracked down his trail, they uncovered links to several disappearances of prominent individuals. His name was attached to shadowy dealings in multiple countries, but there were never any official charges. He had been a ghost for years, and now he was tied to the events surrounding Jane Ember. While the three men sat in custody, each of them maintained their silence, their lips sealed. They had been questioned repeatedly, but nothing they said matched. Their stories contradicted each other, leaving the authorities with even more confusion. The one thing they agreed on was that they had no idea who Jane Ember was. Yet, their body language told a different story. Every time her name was mentioned, they tensed up, their eyes flickering with discomfort. But the biggest breakthrough came when Detective Lance managed to piece together the connections between the key, the map, and the locations marked on it. The coordinates pointed to places of global significance: military outposts, secretive government buildings, and research facilities linked to advanced scientific experiments. It was as if Jane Ember had been at the center of something huge, something far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. The key, however, was still a mystery. It had to unlock something, but what? The detectives couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant to open a door, literally or figuratively, that would lead them to the heart of the operation. They brought in experts to examine it, but there was no immediate answer. The key was made of an unfamiliar metal, and despite its simplicity, it appeared to be designed to fit into a lock somewhere very specific. But where? It wasn't long before the investigation turned towards the connections between Jane Ember and the Syndicate. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that Jane wasn't just an innocent bystander. She had been involved, either willingly or unwillingly, in something far darker than anyone had anticipated. She had been a key figure in a network of operatives, spies, and researchers who were working on projects that were as dangerous as they were secret. In a breakthrough discovery, it was revealed that Jane had spent time in several of the locations marked on the map, though no one knew why. She had visited some of these places under different identities, but the trail was fragmented. Each visit was a mystery in itself, with her changing names and appearances to avoid detection. It seemed that Jane had been a part of the organization, possibly as an operative or a researcher, though it was still unclear what her exact role was. She was more than just a victim. She was someone who had been involved in the very operations they were now investigating. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together, a chilling theory began to emerge. Jane Ember might have been part of a larger, more nefarious project, something involving advanced science, mind control, or manipulation. The symbols she had drawn in her room, the cryptic messages in the notebook, and the references to the gate all pointed toward an experiment or operation that involved controlling or altering the human mind. Was Jane a victim of this? Had she been forced into participating in experiments without her knowledge? Or had she been one of the architects behind them? The more the authorities delved into Jane's past, the more they realized how little they truly knew about her. She had no family, no clear history, and no personal belongings that could provide answers. Everything about her life seemed to have been erased or hidden away. It was as though someone had gone to great lengths to make sure she disappeared, but in the process, they had left behind fragments of a story that was slowly beginning to unfold. The investigation was now at a crossroads. Detective Lance knew they were on the verge of uncovering something monumental, something that could shake the foundations of everything they understood. But time was running out. As the pressure mounted, the Syndicate's reach seemed to extend further than anyone had anticipated. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to hide the truth, they were trying to erase it completely. The closer the investigators got to the heart of the mystery, the more dangerous their pursuit became. And no one knew how far the web of secrecy stretched or how many lives were at stake. The investigation into the case of Jane Ember and the mysterious Syndicate reached a critical juncture. Detective Sarah Lance could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her as the search for the truth continued. The pieces of the puzzle had been scattered, and now with each revelation, the bigger picture was beginning to form. But it was even darker and more dangerous than she had imagined. She knew they were not simply dealing with a criminal syndicate or a rogue operation anymore. They were uncovering an international conspiracy, one that spanned across decades and involved powerful forces that would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. The first breakthrough came when they traced the origins of the key. It had been made from a rare metal that was only produced in a single, highly secretive facility located deep within a remote part of the world. The facility, situated in the mountains of Eastern Europe, had been off the radar for years. It was there, according to long declassified intelligence reports, that some of the most advanced and most unethical projects had taken place. The key was not just a tool, it was a symbol, a way of identifying members of a hidden network that had operated under the radar for decades. This facility, long abandoned on paper, was tied to research that had been classified beyond belief. And Jane Ember had been there. The implications were staggering. The connection between Jane and this facility hinted at something much more sinister than anyone had initially thought. She wasn't just a victim who had stumbled into the wrong hotel room. She was part of a far-reaching scheme, one that involved espionage, brainwashing, and mind control experiments. And this wasn't just a rogue project. It had the backing of powerful, well-connected individuals across the globe. For years, they had been working in secret, carrying out experiments under the guise of legitimate research, while quietly manipulating and controlling lives. Jane Ember had been one of their subjects, and she had narrowly escaped whatever had been done to her. The authorities were now desperate to find out what had happened to Jane in the months leading up to the hotel incident. It was clear she had been involved in the Syndicate's operations at some point, but whether she had been working for them or had been manipulated into their activities was still unclear. The fact that she had been found in a hotel room, drugged, and seemingly incapable of identifying herself suggested that something had gone wrong. She had been caught in the web of their secretive plans, and now she was trying to break free. As the investigation pressed forward, the three men, Viktor Drovak, Luan Rizek, and Amir Galeen, continued to remain silent. Despite the mounting evidence against them, they refused to reveal anything about their connection to Jane or the operation. They remained stoic, but their eyes told a different story. Every so often, the slightest flicker of recognition would pass between them, but it was always quickly concealed. They knew far more than they were willing to admit. It wasn't until the forensic team re-examined the documents and materials from the hotel room that they uncovered something truly shocking. Among the charred remains of the notebook and the other documents was a small piece of evidence that had been overlooked during the initial investigation: a photograph. It was a blurry image of a woman standing in front of the Eastern European facility, looking far younger than Jane Ember appeared to be now. There was no doubt in the team's mind. The woman in the photograph was Jane. The photograph had been taken years ago, during what seemed to be a visit to the facility when she had likely been involved with whatever research was taking place there. This photo was the key. Jane wasn't just a subject of the experiments. She had been involved in their development. The discovery of the photograph shifted the direction of the investigation. Jane Ember wasn't a mere victim. She was someone who had been a part of the very system that was now causing her harm. What role had she played in the Syndicate's operations? Was she an unwilling participant, or had she been an active member in the program? Detective Lance knew that in order to get to the bottom of this, they needed to find Jane. But Jane, in her fragile state, wasn't talking. They had no leads on where she had gone after her release from the psychiatric facility, and with each passing day, the chances of finding her grew slimmer. The Syndicate, now fully aware that the authorities were closing in, began to pull strings to cover their tracks. Black market operations, false leads, and high-level cover-ups made it increasingly difficult to track down any information. It became clear that Jane's disappearance was no accident. Someone was intentionally keeping her hidden, preventing the authorities from uncovering the truth. The key, the map, the notebook, everything pointed to one location: the Eastern European facility. The only way to solve the case was to return there, to find out what had happened to Jane and what she had been part of. The facility had long been abandoned in the eyes of the public, but the investigation had revealed that it was still very much in operation, under a new guise, hidden from the world. With no other options left, Detective Lance and her team made the decision to mount a daring operation to infiltrate the facility. It was a risk, one that could cost them everything, but it was the only way to find Jane and uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. The authorities could no longer afford to ignore the truth. Jane Ember was the key, and if they could find her, they would unravel everything. The stakes had never been higher. The Syndicate was closing in, and Jane's fate hung in the balance. The investigation had become far more than a case. It had become a battle for the truth, one that would take everything they had to uncover. And as Detective Lance prepared for the final push, she realized that the truth about Jane Ember was more dangerous than anyone could have imagined.